Disciplinary Literacy Exploration for History class by Brad Davis. So in history class, there's a few different reading and writing practices that all the students are going to need to be able to do. So the first one is looking for and understanding bias. Any of the texts that you're going to be reading for history class are going to be written by people for usually some sort of political reason. And because of that, bias creeps into everything. People can't do anything without being at least a little bit biased. And it's important for a student of history to be able to identify the biases of the author to better understand why they're saying what they're saying and how what is being written may not be true. Nothing is actually truly a fact for the most part in history class. There's unless you're talking about a specific date, time, some event, something like that. If somebody's giving an opinion, there's going to be some sort of error in that. Another part of that is comparing multiple texts. Because you have different people writing different texts, you need to be able to look at them side by side, compare what's the same, what's different, which author may be more accurate, why might one author know a specific part of what you're trying to read better than the other author, and be able to take from both texts to increase your knowledge of what you're trying to understand. And understanding the context of that the text is in is another huge part of that, because everybody that writes their opinions down is shaped by whatever context they're writing in, whether it's their upbringing, their own personal political beliefs, or what's happening in the event in the world at the time that they're writing. All of that kind of context can change the way somebody writes and their ideas, and understanding that is a huge part of looking at the bias from the first part. So the last part is understanding the differences in first and second person accounts. In history class, you have a lot of different kinds of texts. You have some that were written at the time that you were researching. Other ones are written by people afterwards about specific times in history. And a reader needs to be able to understand the differences and the advantages and disadvantages for each type of account. So now looking at the vocabulary that history students are going to need to know. The first one is time period relevant words. So when you're reading history, especially first person accounts, how depending on how far back you're going to get a lot of language that isn't used now. In the 1800s, it's the language is pretty modern, but if you go back before the 1800s, there's a lot of words that are still English but are very foreign to us because they just aren't used, or the grammar's different. And so you do need to be able to be flexible and be able to understand a passage even if you don't understand certain words or the certain context that words are being used in. Another kind of vocabulary is just your typical names, places, dates. A lot of history is just looking at specifics, and history class shouldn't be just about names, places, and dates, but that has to be at least a decent amount of the class, because students need to understand who did stuff, when stuff happened, and where it happened, because without that understanding, they won't understand the more nuanced ideas of history. So another kind of vocabulary is economic and governmental terms, things like market, depression, cycles, words that can have multiple meanings depending on the context. But when you're dealing with history, a lot of it has to do with government stuff, economic stuff, and these words pop up a lot, especially depending on what time period you're looking at. If you're looking at the Great Depression, a lot of stuff is going to be about economic stuff. If you're looking at more like a war kind of thing, there's going to be economic and governmental terms, although not as much if you're not studying something focused on economics. The last bullet point is more of a general vocabulary idea, and that's a lot more ideological vocabulary, where you get a lot of vocabulary that's meant to be understood in your own way, basically. It's or in the way that the author meant it. There isn't a lot of kind of very hard, specific words. It's people writing their own feelings, their own opinions. And so the vocabulary you're going to experience is going to reflect that kind of ideological nature of people's writing. So, in history class, there are many types of communication that students can use depending on what the project or what the assignment they're trying to complete is. The main thing you see students complete is essays. That's kind of, there's a DBQ at the end of every Regents exam in high school. Usually there's big term papers in college, stuff like that. And it can be a great way for students to put forth their ideas and make their arguments, because that's really the core of history, is using facts that have happened in the past to support a certain argument. But essays are not the only way that students can convey that they know what they're talking about when it comes to history. And in fact, including different kinds of communication that aren't essays can actually engage students more, because when students hear essays, they just immediately usually tune out. So speeches are a great way for people to communicate, because it does the same thing that an essay does, in that you have to create an argument and back it up with facts, but it adds a bit of kind of dramatic flair to it, because the speech is designed to convince people. You're supposed to be a little bit theatrical in it. You're supposed to try to win over a crowd. And so it gives students the freedom to add more creativity that they don't feel like they should put into a formal essay. Social media, it's one that teachers have used in the past, and it can be really good if used correctly, because students are on social media all the time, and using that to create Twitter pages for different historical figures or something like that can really help to engage students in the lesson using tools that they're already familiar with. The one thing for social media that teachers have to be careful of is they don't come across as they're trying too hard, because that's something that can happen where teachers, it feels like they're just kind of out of touch, and it's, well, this is what the kids use. They use the Twitter book or whatever, so we'll just use that in class. And so you want to make sure you're not coming off as kind of disingenuous, and you understand the social media that you're going to have the students use. Video presentations and songs, they kind of go together. They can be a great way to do what the speeches did in adding creativity to the assignment, but not using a different types of creativity than what the speeches do. It requires students to use different kinds of skills in making the video, in writing the script, stuff like that. And it allows students to do more body language, reactions, kind of playing with scenery and stuff to really convey what they're trying to convey in whatever assignment you're doing. Songs work the same way. Rap is another, it is a song basically, and that works really well. Look at like what Hamilton has done with combining history and rap, and having your students do stuff like that can really increase the engagement and make students really interested in completing the assignment. When it comes to the type of text that history students are going to be faced with, there is a huge amount of them. Some of the main ones, you have books. This can both be kind of a textbook, or it can be a book written by a historian or some sort of secondary source about a certain historical topic. You also have movies. So with the movies, it depends on how historically accurate are. There are a lot of historical movies that have very, very little historical accuracy, and it'll be up to the teacher to kind of screen those kind of things. But a lot of movies do offer a lot of value to a classroom. So speeches are another type of literacy that the students are going to be faced with, and this can be either watching a speech be given, listening to it, or reading a transcript of the speech. You have first person and second person accounts. These cover any of the books, movies, speeches, uh, stuff, first hand accounts, stuff like that. The first person accounts are accounts written at the time of whatever event you're looking at. These can be things like letters or announcements or just kind of diaries, stuff like that. Second person accounts are any account that didn't take place at the time you're looking at. These are usually written by historians or other history people who are going back into the history and writing their opinions on it or why they think stuff like this happened. Art is one people don't really think about, but it does pop up in history class a lot, especially when you're looking at the Renaissance or the Greeks or the Romans. There's a lot to be gained from looking at art and looking at how the culture and the social mores were imprinted into the art and the way artists conveyed the culture of the time. And then the last one, social media, it's more of a new one. And as history progresses and we get, a decade from now, 2 decades from now, we're going to start covering more modern things in our history classes. And in our current culture, social media is the number one way we communicate. So it's going to be extremely important to look at social media, look at different tweets, Facebook posts, Instagram, Vine, Snapchat, everything like that, and use those to try to understand the culture and the ideas of the times that we're living in now or like a decade ago, that starting around that era. So, looking at the way that history literacy compares to the other core subjects, it it takes a lot of different parts from the other core subjects and includes it in its own literacy. So history relies on the interpretation of works, just like the English language arts does. In history, most things you're going to be reading or looking at have been created by a person. And when you're looking at something that's been created by a person, it's important to both understand and interpret what the author is trying to convey, but also it's important to interpret the author themselves and their own biases, why they're writing it, how could they be right, what information could make them wrong, stuff like that. History also uses the systematic deduction of science and math. There is a lot of facts, and it takes this kind of building from the ground up and working your way to a conclusion that you see in a lot of science and math literacy. You take and there Nothing is a solid fact. It doesn't have the rigidity of math and science, but it builds on itself and it uses things that are as close to facts as we can get to build on arguments. Literacy in history is very similar to the social sciences like psychology and sociology, where you have different facts and statistics that are as close to true as we can get, but they're not 100% true because we can't get 100% certainty with the information that we're dealing with. So we get as close as possible and make sure we understand places where we could be wrong and our information could be skewed.